This is the WTF Bach podcast. The podcast about Johann Sebastian Bach, brought to you by his prodigal son, WTF Bach. Join WTF Bach as he guides your mind through a contrapuntal journey. Why don't you let WTF Bach guide you? And now, here's WTF Bach.
It's WTF Bach here, Evan Shinners. Have you recovered from your 70-minute Shakespearean injection, or are you still in a stanza coma? Well, it's back to the Brook today, and we've entered a tempus clausum, if you're listening concurrently, a closed time in the liturgical year. It's Lent right about now, so this means for Bach, no florid church music. For Bach, that translates to no cantatas and no organ playing, or at least no elaborate preludes or postludes, just a simple functional accompaniment on the organ, maybe a chorale here and there. But yes, no cantatas, no weekly cantata, and don't say the A word, the word that begins with A and ends with Alleluia. Tempus clausum is a time of reflection and repentance, and there's no big weddings, so this all would have been a welcome break for the busy Bach, taking time away from his weekly cantata output to prepare something a little more scaled back, like a passion work for double chorus and orchestra. The man never stopped working, but he does have the time during this period to prepare his passion music, and it doesn't mean for us on this podcast that we can't have cantatas or organ music during this tempus clausum, and in fact we'll have a bit of both in this episode, and I will be reverting to the longer episode. Most of you wrote you prefer these episodes closer to about an hour long. However, I will try and accommodate those of you who prefer to WTF on your coffee break, and I will try and put a natural place to pause every 20 minutes or so. And just speaking of the trajectory of this podcast, I'm going to focus on single works in these upcoming episodes. No multiple episodic subjects, one episode per piece. Tune in, tune out, and we are coming up on 100 episodes in this podcast, which is very hard for me to believe. I still need to think of something special to do for number 100, but something special that you can do is recommend this podcast to your friend. I mean, send this episode to your father-in-law or your roommate's ex, because I feel like those are two of my primary demographics. Anyhow, the piece today is a classic. It's a JSB hit, as it were. This is a cantata number 106, Gottes Zeit ist der allerbeste Zeit. God's time is the all-best time, also known as the Actus Tragicus. I'm going to focus on two movements from this piece and then talk about a melody that Bach uses to structure one of those movements, an aria toward the end of the cantata, and then we'll see how Bach sets the same melody in one of his shorter organ pieces. So let's dive in.
This is the place to come for all your needs. All your needs for Bach. Through the mind of the greatest composer, ... Do you ever wonder what makes Bach, Bach, Bach?
Okay, so this is the Actus Tragicus, the tragic act. That is the title that comes to us from an edition that is after Bach's death, the earliest edition from 1768. This is one of the composer's earliest cantatas. Bach was 22 when he wrote this, working in Mühlhausen, and this is funeral music. Now, we often turn to Albert Schweitzer, the most undeniably poetic writing about Bach from his 1905 biography of the composer. It is not up to today's scholastic standards. Let's say a lot of the musicology has been discredited, but it's still, even as Christoph Wolff said here on this show, this is really still the inspiration for a lot of the scholarship. Just going to read a few pages from his writing on this particular cantata. We do not know for whose death the mourning cantata Gottes Zeit ist die allerbeste Zeit, number 106, was written. Spitter's research shew that there was no death in the ducal family at that time. It seems to have been an old man to whom mit Fried und Freud fahr ich dahin, from Simeon's song of praise would have been appropriate. The text is as perfect as the music. It is composed of verses from the Bible in which the antithesis is worked out between the Old Testament fear of death and the New Testament joy in death. Quote, "Put thy house in order, for thou must die," says the prophet Isaiah, whereupon the chorus joins in with, "It is the old decree. But at once a soprano strikes in, as if hasting hither from another world with the final call of the apocalypse, "Yes, come, Lord Jesu, come!" To which the orchestra adds the chorale, "Ich hab mein Sach Gott heimgestellt." I have cast my care on God. We can see the cross on Golgotha. The soul repeats the words of Jesus, "Into thy hands I commend my spirit," and is answered with the words spoken to the thief, "This day thou shalt be with me in paradise." The comforted soul sings, "In joy and peace I pass away," and finally the chorale, "Glorie, Lob, und Herrlichkeit," glory, praise, honor, and joy, is sung to the melody, "Ich hab dich, ich gehoffet, Herr." In thee, my Lord, is my hope. The last line, "Through Jesus Christ, Amen," widens out into a brilliant fantasia, which terminates with a theme in augmentation in the orchestra. Bach probably compiled the text of this cantata himself. It was certainly not done by any Weimar poet, for none of the poets of this time would have been so self-denying as to have refrained from introducing verses of his own. In any case, this is one of the most perfect texts from the musical point of view to be found anywhere. The work commences with a sonatina for 2 flutes, 2 gambas, continuo, and organ. It is based on a motive in E-flat, expressive of transfigured grief. This runs through the entire work. To grasp these harmonies is to be transported far from all earthly pain. The words from the Apocalypse come into one's mind that Bach probably had in his. "And God shall wipe away all tears from their eyes, and there shall be no more death, neither sorrow nor crying, neither shall there be any more pain, for the former things are passed away." No other instruments are used in the cantata besides the 2 flutes and the 2 gambas. Their veiled timbre belongs to the very essence of the music. We seem to see an autumn landscape with blue mists floating across it. The dramatic life and the intimate union of words and music in the Actus Tragicus specially endeared it to the early admirers of Bach, among them Zelter. The cantata was first publicly revived by the Cecilia Society of the Frankfurt on the Main under Schelba in May 1833. It had to be repeated in December, and it was still called for and was given again each of the 2 following years. It was first published in 1830 by Simrock. If it was the St. Matthew Passion that rescued Bach's music from its Babylonian captivity, it was the Actus Tragicus that prepared the path for its return and leveled the ground for it. Even when we know all the cantatas, we always go back with pleasure to this work, written by Bach at the end of his 20th year. The Actus Tragicus was the favorite cantata of Julius Stockhausen. Yes, so that is a lovely passage. Both volumes of Schweitzer's biography is really like this, and it's so impressive to see this 30-year-old young man writing so expressively about Bach, and it makes you wish that if only scholars would write today about the blue mists and the transfigured nature and leaving all earthly pain when they write about Bach. So let's go into that motive Schweitzer calls transfigured grief from the sonatina. And like he says, 2 flutes, although these are not the transverse flutes, these are the recorder flutes, and 2 gambas. That's it. That's the entire orchestra plus the continuo. Delving right in, it's the continuo that first speaks. Bum, 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 bum. In 8th notes. Dee, dee. It's marked molto adagio. More than just very slow, but very at ease, adagio. We are not getting anywhere. And on top of this bass line that you've just heard, the 2 gambas sing in parallel sixths. Oh, those sighing sixths. In fact, because this movement is so short, I'm just going to play the bottom 3 voices, that is the 2 gambas and the continuo, and just see this absolute beautiful backdrop that Bach lays for these 2 flutes to go on top. that's such a cozy little bed. Don't you just want to snuggle up in it, lie down with your fipple flute, and play this wonderful sonatina? Now, if you've heard this, I'm sure you're humming the melody along with this, because you really can't forget this initial gesture that the two flutes sing. It is based on this this sighing thing, although the interval is bigger. It begins like this. So we have this but then a larger interval, and this tritone will gradually get bigger into a sixth, and then eventually a seventh. But the real magic of this moment is that you're not quite sure if you're hearing one flute or two flutes. They begin in unison, but one sort of drops out only on very few of the notes. So here is the entire line as you hear it. Okay, and then a similar phrase. And then a similar phrase again. Okay, right, 3 phrases. But here's what the second recorder is playing. It's not playing all of it. It only plays this. Right? Here's the second phrase. And here's the third phrase. He's making space for the other instrument to shine. So what I'm going to do right now is play both flutes in opposite speakers, one in your right, one in your left, and you will hear what seems like you're listening to one flute in both your speakers, but then one of them will drop out, just as I've demonstrated, and you'll get the sense, in fact, I am listening to 2 different instruments, and then Bach will use this magical effect to achieve magical results. Here we go. My word, what an incredible effect, what an incredible moment in music. And, Bach, when he goes into the harmony, you realize not only am I hearing 2 flutes, but in fact they can play 2 notes at the same time. And then it goes into something what I believe is even more mysterious and sublime, this sort of playing on the half step that will turn into the whole step. Let's listen to it in both our speakers and really listen, just marvel at this effect that the young Bach achieves. Are you hearing that correctly? I mean, did that just happen to your ears? First you hear the half step in your left, then you hear it in your right. Doesn't this make you want to go out and join a Baroque band? But the antiphonal quality, this masterful effect that Bach achieves. We're going to hear it one more time, and I won't tease you any further. I will play the rest of the sonatina with it. But it's just in these very, very simple gestures that Bach is able to create the world. He starts with a phrase in unison, and by just snipping out a little bit of that phrase in one instrument, he achieves this unbelievable effect. And then by staggering a half step, just by one beat, just staggering a bit of the phrase, he achieves yet a different type of double instrumental effect. Here is the entire flute line, both flutes of the opening movement of this cantata. What a marvel, what an absolute wonder, what a jewel of the repertoire. And did you hear this toward the end? The flutes no longer using this half-step motif, but going back and forth between the fourth and the half-step. And that will come over when we finally add the lower voices. That will come over this astoundingly gorgeous ascending chord progression. Wonderful. And so now let's do that. Right now, let's hear friend of the show, Josh Rifkin's recording of this first movement of the cantata BWV 106. I call that a piece of wonder now. And if you are listening to this episode in 20-minute segments or so, here is your intermission. And I will be on with a new subject now in 5, 4, 3. I want to speak to you a little bit about the old cantata form and the new cantata form. If you've ever heard a cantata, you might be used to something which sounds a bit like this. A big chorus, big opening movement, everyone is involved, there's a grand overture, and after this number, it's followed by some twiddling on the harpsichord and a singer sing-songing in a recitativo, typically followed by an aria. Now this will repeat 2 or 3 times with changes of instrumentation. Maybe you get a duet or a terzet. Maybe there's another piece for full choir in the middle, but mostly it's switching between the recitativos and the arias, and the cantata is bookended by pieces for the full choir, and often a chorale ends the work. This is the new model of the cantata. Text is written by a contemporary poet. It's new text, it's not scripture. Bach is working with one of the many poets he worked with throughout his career. And this model is in fact mostly based on Italian opera, which was quite popular. And this was the fashion when Bach was writing the bulk of his cantatas. But the old model of the cantata is in fact less structured. It consists in the composer himself choosing biblical passages and Lutheran hymns to sort of set sections where they contrast each other and they build up dramatically. And this means that the music sort of doesn't stop, that a piece will suddenly shift in tempo or meter or even shift keys. When we see past Bach into the future, it looks more like the future of opera than the Italian opera. It looks more like Wagner, where one piece just sort of blends into the next. And the Actus Tragicus, this cantata, is definitely one of these old models. Let me quote a little more of Schweitzer here, his very poetic writing. When Bach was made concertmaster in 1714, it became his duty to supply each year a definite number of compositions for the church. In place of dramatic texts compiled from biblical verses and stanzas from hymns, we now get wretched poems that are always cut out to the same pattern. The aria is supplanted by the da capo aria and the secco recitative. The plan is still further impoverished by the fact that the choir now recedes wholly into the background. It figures only at the beginning and the end. There is none of the animated alteration between solo and chorus that we find in the Actus Tragicus and the cantata Aus der Tiefe. Nor does the composer now try to cast the whole work into one mold. The cantata henceforth divides into separate numbers. How was it possible for Bach to renounce in a moment all the artistic riches that he had been able to use with such masterly effect in his first cantatas? How can we account for the fact that henceforth he never returned, even in one exceptional case, to the form of the old cantata? As we read the Bible, we regret more than anything that he, a Bible student, should have refrained from setting so many splendid passages that certainly would have been attractive to him as a musician, merely because there were no continuous biblical passages in the cantata form that he had adopted. There is hardly an admirer of his who has not felt that he would give the 200 church cantatas for 100 works in the style of the Actus Tragicus. Quite a pointed opinion there. And there's a footnote here about the Actus Tragicus saying that it is a curious fact that one of the Bach pioneers, Moritz Hauptmann, though admiring the Actus Tragicus, thought its musical structure, quote, a monstrosity of movements that jostle and hang on to each other. The footnote goes on, Spitta explains Bach's adoption of the da capo aria in this way. Quote, when Bach had made himself familiar with the Italian da capo aria, he became conscious of a waste of power, since in this form he could say many things in a simpler and therefore better way without foregoing any of his originality. End quote. Then Schweitzer goes on, it's hard to see what waste of power there is in composition in the style of the Actus Tragicus, nor is it any easier to understand how anything can be better or more simply expressed in the da capo aria than in the old arioso. Spitta is trying to explain the inexplicable without falling back on the only possible solution, that Bach simply followed the fashion. So maybe that should set your imagination on fire a little bit about what exactly was going on with the forms of sung music in this day, Italian opera becoming popular, and this old fashion of cantata writing, which eventually looked more like the future of opera, sort of fell out of fashion. And while making this episode, I've had to resist the temptation to cover the entirety of this cantata for time's sake, but it's pretty much impossible to start in the middle of one of these long through composed numbers for the reasons that we just read about. Let's listen, therefore, to where it begins just after the wonderful instrumental sonatina we've just heard, and I'll pop in here and there and guide your ears toward something to listen for before we really delve into a fugue and an aria. This is Masakai Suzuki now. Okay, that was the opening little section, and you can hear that the new section has already started. The text there was, God's time is the very best time, and that little instrumental cadence you heard there at the end, something like this. Although I suppose they're doing it down lower. These motifs, doesn't that remind you a bit of this dee-da-ta, this sighing motif, which indeed will be throughout the entire piece. That motif, those steps, those downward steps, are typically associated with grief because, after all, this is funeral music, let's not forget. Bach is really a believer of the idea of, look, even though this is death, it was God who chose this time for death, so let's see if we can look at it In that way, remember, Schweitzer said that this cantata was the antithesis worked out between Old Testament fear of death and the New Testament joy in death. So here is from this little orchestral cadenza, again, into the new section. And now the text is going to quote the Acts of the Apostles. In him we live, we move, and we are so long as he wills. And when Bach says so long as he wills, watch what he does with the word long. Here we go. Yes, that is so long as he wills. The sopranos there holding that note as long as they can. And then Bach will say, oh yes, how long can you flute players also hold your breath on this trill? And then the text changes to, in him we die. And listen to how immediately the texture changes on the word death. And listen to this. So there we are. The movement is still going, but we've been through 3 different tempi and moods already, and the cantata will go on like this until the end, really. I know it's hard, but I'm going to skip a bit. Bach will quote from the Old Testament, from the Psalms and Isaiah, and then a very interesting movement quoting from the book of Sirach, which is a book I didn't know about, but Bach did. It's a Jewish literary work originally written in biblical Hebrew, the longest extant wisdom book from antiquity, consisting of ethical teachings written between 196 and 175 BCE. But what does Bach quote from Sirach? He says, "Es ist der alte Bund, Mensch, du musst sterben." It's the old law, man, or the old covenant, humans. You must die. And at this old law, Bach reverts to, well, the old law of music, the fugue. He begins writing a fugue in the choir, which is very similar, oddly enough, to the fugue from the Well-Tempered Clavier in the same key. This is them saying, Est ist der alte Bund, it is the old law that you must die. And listen to how similar that is to the... This is the Well-Tempered Clavier. And in this cantata, the Well-Tempered, amazing how he's just tossing these figures over and over in his head. Anyhow, the lower 3 voices discuss among themselves. You must die, you must die. Du musst sterben. Yes, this is the old law. You have to die, you have to die. But then, floating on top of these lower 3 voices, marked solo, the soprano, no longer quoting from the old books, but now quoting from Revelation, saying, Komm, Jesu, komm. Komm, Herr Jesu. Yes, come, Lord Jesus, come. And we get this image, again, the 22-year-old Bach, able to do this in tone, giving us the image of old death, the old fear of death and the old law, and the new death, a joyful union with God in paradise. I mean, for funeral music, you can actually see the soul, the deceased, sort of rising above the congregation, discussing the law and discussing, and you get this not merely once in this cantata. Here it is. Here's the fugue. choir comes back in, and the movement will go on a bit more. So that is easy enough to hear, the juxtaposition of the two ideas. But did you hear the flutes doing something a little ominous a few bars back? I will rewind just a bit and direct our ears toward it. Okay, it's a bit difficult to hear, but it's in there. I'll play it one more time and bang out the melody. If you look at a lot of church cantatas, Bach cantatas in particular, you will probably start to see these things, that those notes there are not merely decorative notes. Those notes are, in fact, the notes, the melody from a Lutheran hymn. And the churchgoer in those days would have heard this and recognized this and associated with it. That is the melody from a Lutheran hymn from 1589. Ich hab mein Sach Gott heimgestellt. I've left my things, I've left my concerns up to God. The text continues, let him do whatever he wants with me. If I continue to live here still longer without striving against him, I will surrender to his will. So this is, again, Bach consoling the grieving. It's God's time. Leave your concerns with God. And just the way that this melody appears only once in those recorders, this is what Schweitzer means when he's talking about the masterly weaving of biblical verse and Lutheran hymn, because here in this movement, we've got the lower three voices reciting the text from an old Hebrew book, and then this upper voice, the book of Revelation, and then these recorders without text quoting a hymn from 1589, and it's all very, very free, the weaving of these elements. You could tell why someone like Schweitzer, who later championed Wagner, would regret this newer style of the cantata to come. It's just not as, it's not as Wagnerian for sure. And we've seen on this podcast how Bach will use the Lutheran church melody as a structuring device, as a structural device. But here, this church melody isn't structural the way it appears in these recorders. It's most imaginatively inserted, and it appears only that once, without the text, almost getting into the grieving ear subliminally. Okay, let's continue with the rest of this dialogue between soprano solo and the old law, and then we're at the aria that I want to focus on for the rest of the episode. I'm laughing with, gotta pull myself together, that ending. What a moment. What a singular moment in music. The soprano, no one else, no bass. You can almost see the spirit rising up and out of the church That ultimate phrase in the rest of the band suddenly has these long, long slurs on this long word, die. You have Du musst sterben. And Bach begins to write pianissimo everywhere, a very rare dynamic for Bach, and then he writes tasto solo in the continuo. Don't add chords, just play the bass notes. But then even the bass drops out, and our wayward spirit, this wild sounding, like almost Arabic sounding musical phrase, like just you can see it. Where should I go? Where should I go? And that solo cuts out there on beat 2. So then you have beat 2, 3, 4, and then Bach adds even an additional bar of rest. So you've got a total of 7 bars of silence. Now, for me, that moment, I mean, you can hear the solo fighting with the lower 3 voices, as if our own emotions. Can you imagine being a believer in those days? You're saying, okay, it's God's will. I'm leaving it up to God. I believe he knows exactly what I'm doing. Yes, Jesus, this spirit is for you. But also, excuse me, this is not easy. This is death. It's down here. This is the old law. You must die. And I'm sorry, that's difficult. You can hear them exchanging these musical phrases. You can really see this union, even though it might not be a pleasant union to experience, of the Old Testament and the New Testament. And did you also hear that soprano singing there in that figure? Yahokom, Yahokom. Well, that's exactly the type of thing that unifies this cantata from the very opening sinfonia that we heard with the 2 recorders. That's that figure there, really making its way throughout this entire cantata. Okay, again, if you're one of those people who likes to take a 20-minute break or so, this is a nice place to pause the cantata. And I will be back with the next aria in 5, 4. Okay, welcome back. Now we are in the Actus Tragicus BWV 106, Bach's early cantata at age 22 from Mühlhausen, and we are at the penultimate piece of a very through-composed cantata, a duet between bass and alto. And Bach here turns the subject directly to the words of Christ on the cross in the Gospel of Luke, where in fact Jesus himself starts quoting the scriptures. So another blend of Old and New Testament. Jesus, his dying words in the Gospel of Luke are from the Psalms. Father, into your hands I commend my spirit. So Bach begins this aria, and what better way to paint those words into your hands than an upward rising scale. Those are into your hands, indeed, I commend my spirit. God's hands are presumably up there, so it is going up. But again, there's a bit of strife. The continuo is going up, but the alto is singing in deine Hände. In deine Hände, like, oh, in deine Hände. Excuse my falsetto, but in deine Hände. I'm really trying to, but it's difficult. Death is not easy. The continuo saying, oh, come on, you give yourself up to God, right? But he's going, You'll have a bit of the contrast between the 2 motifs there. Let's listen to it. what is this? This is a new section, yes, and the continuo instrumentation changed. That's Rudolf Lutz and his J.S. Bach Foundation playing very beautifully there. But now it's a new singer, and it's a new quotation from the Gospel of Luke. The alto was continuing the psalm that Jesus is quoting on the cross, but then, heute, today you will be with me. That is what Jesus said to the thief. So you can imagine experiencing it now. I think if I were there and this were a funeral of someone I loved, I would not be able to contain myself at this thought, at this grief, and yet this consolation that today you will be with me in paradise. That's what Jesus says to the thief dying on the cross next to him. And you will be with me in paradise. And the way that Bach sets paradise is absolutely wonderful. We will hear it, and then at the next sort of instrumentation change, we will discuss.
Heute wirst du mit mir. Heute wirst du mit mir. Mit mir im Paradies. Im Paradies sein. Im Paradies. Im Paradies. Im Paradies. Im Paradies sein. Heute wirst du mit mir. Heute wirst du mit mir im Paradies sein. Im Paradies, im Paradies, im Paradies sein. Heute.
And there is our next section. The alto right there begins putting in another church hymn. So we've got, again, the mixture of Old Testament and New Testament and Lutheran hymn. And I don't know about that section in Paradise, about you. I mean, in a canon, if Paradise sounds like anything, to me it sounds like strict counterpoint. Maybe that sounds like hell to you, but it certainly sounds very nice when Bach does it. Anyways, in Paradise, yes, this beautiful phrase, and then when the alto starts coming back in, all of a sudden the viola da gambas come back in. So far, this aria has been nothing but continuo and the two singers, but the viola da gambas will enter and they will accompany the alto singing very slowly this 1524 hymn, Mit Fried und Freud ich fahr dahin, the text of which is, with peace and joy I go therein, according to God's will, I'm consoled in heart and mind. I'm gentle and quiet, because as God promised me, death has become my sleep. So yet another consolation in death. And I'm going to sort of do an electric version so we can dissect this, the Lutheran church melody in both your speakers and either viola da gamba on either side of you, just so you can hear what's going on before we listen to the Lutz again. Okay, you will never hear a a performance of this music that quickly, but just to show you that's sort of a bird's eye view of what the music is. You've got both viola da gambas sort of weaving their way round this beautiful chorale melody. The bass aria will sort of cut out halfway through, and we think about the bass being associated with the voice of Jesus in the Passions. Christ was always a bass in the Passions, and so we've got Christ on the cross here saying, yes, you're going to be with me in paradise, and then the alto singing this Lutheran church melody. And Bach also includes these expressive dynamics, which are, I would say, extremely rare in the cantata writing. For example, just on one word, schlaf, sleep, Bach writes piano toward that end of this melody here. Der Tod ist mein Schlaf worden. That death is my sleep. Sleep, 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 very long and very quiet. Become, and back to forte. Yeah, I would say that's extremely rare. Bach just writing one dynamic on one single note. So we will listen to this aria now from where the alto begins singing the Lutheran hymn from 1524, where the bass will be singing the words of Christ on the cross, and you've got the two gambas joining in, sort of forming their own chorale prelude around the Lutheran hymn. The bass will drop out, and Again, this upper voice, I mentioned earlier in the podcast, we get this image of the soul of the departed really sort of hanging above all these other things. And here will be yet another time that happens, and it will finish sort of alone with the two gambas weaving their way around the melody. It's absolutely wonderful. That is mostly it for today's episode, though I still have a couple of tunes to play it out, as it were. I hope you got something out of it, and I hope you like this new format, or return to the old format, these longer episodes. They will take a bit longer for me to put out. I'll aim for about 2 a month, as they take me 3 days to record, and then a little longer if I'm doing the research straight from scratch. So I can't quite commit to the 1 episode per week. Maybe you'd like a mixture of short and long episodes. I don't know. Tell me. I'm only basing all these decisions on what I hear from you when you write me. So if you've got an idea, don't be shy. Please write. Let your voice be heard. The church melody that we just heard is a melody that we heard before on this channel, specifically in the episode about tuning, and I made a YouTube video on the chorale where I played it in 2 different tunings. I think that's possibly one of my better moments in illustrating something that we take for granted in today's musical world that we probably shouldn't. Tuning, I mean specifically. So if you haven't seen that, it's only 100 seconds long, and I'll make sure there is a link to it in the description. So here is an organ setting of the same chorale. Again, mit Fried und Freud, ich fahr dahin. This is one from the Orgelbüchlein, the little organ book. This is a body of work I definitely want to get into more on this show. Briefly, it's a book of elaborated chorales. So instead of a 4-part chorale like you sing in church with 4 voices sort of moving roughly 1 quarter note per part, you get this wiggly, squiggly, wobbly chorale on the same tune and similar harmony. It's an elaborated chorale on the 4 parts. So you imagine instead of singing 1 quarter note, you sing 4 16th notes around that same quarter note. And after I play that, I'm going to leave you with my own singing of the opening movement of this Actus Tragicus, because I've been having a lot of fun with a group of friends sending chorales to each other on our phones. And this was one of our projects one day to sing through this. So yes, there you go. Enjoy. Hope you liked this episode. Thanks very much for listening.
Thanks for listening to the WTF Bach podcast. We couldn't make this podcast without the support from listeners like you. The best way to help this podcast along is to become a paid subscriber on Evan's Substack. You'll not only get every episode of the podcast, but detailed notes, occasional writings, and videos. If you join for as little as $80 a year, you'll be helping us out tremendously. You can also make a one-time donation on Venmo, Cash App, or PayPal. All relevant links are found in this episode's description. We also want to hear from you. So if you have an idea, a favorite piece, or a suggestion, give us a shout. Bach at WTFBach.com. We get notes from almost every corner of the globe every week. It makes our days to hear from you. So thank you for listening.